All right, now we are recording. And it'd probably be handy to have your Bible, even though I've tried to put the most important scriptures on a PowerPoint so that you could not just look at the scriptures, but maybe see some visuals to go along with it, especially when we start breaking down the Hebrew text. I took screenshots of the passage and then with red arrows pointing to the word that we're looking at, which makes it easier for some people that if you don't read Hebrew that well, or you're just learning your letters, it helps to kind of isolate the word. Otherwise, it's like a sea of Hebrew that you're falling into. I wanted to start, though, back at the beginning in chapter 12, verse 5. Chapter 12, verse 5. And remember, they have made a pit stop in a place called Haran. Haran. They have passed over the Euphrates. They've passed over the Great River, which is one characteristic of being an Ivri or a Hebrew. But as we saw last night, as we went through the text, we realized that Abram or Abraham, he's not really characterized by one great passing over or one great crossing over. He's characterized by many passings and many crossings, tests. Each location where he goes, there's some sort of test involved or some growth in terms of the journey. And that's what we can say about ourselves. If we are Hebrews, if we are Ivri, then our lives should be characterized, yes, by an initial crossing over, making that great decision to cross the Parat River or the Euphrates River, which is sourced from the throne itself. But once we pass that great river, we keep passing. We keep crossing. We keep coming to new rivers. We keep coming to new obstacles that we're going to have to cross over. And if we have time at the end of the lesson today, I want to show you how the 4 altar judgments that we've looked at, you can see all 4 of those altar judgments in this one Torah portion as it concerns the life of Abraham and Sarah. But the verse in chapter 12, verse 5, it says, Avram took his wife Sarai and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had amassed, and the souls that they made in Haran. And they left to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to the land of Canaan. The focus there, again, this is where Hebrew helps, because different English translations especially will experiment with what exactly that meant in the Hebrew text. But the Hebrew text is pretty unequivocal. It says in Hebrew that they made souls. Now, we know people don't make people. There's only one creator of people. So what is that saying about the souls that Abraham and Sarah made in Haran? Well, in one sense, like parents, and we're told in Isaiah that we are to look to Abraham and Sarah as our spiritual father and mother. So in the same way that a physical father and mother help discipline and teach and shape a child's soul that's been born into their family, we know that their influence does shape that child. In the same way, Abraham and Sarah, in this little paleo-prophetic action, even in Haran, even before they get to the actual destination, which they never really reach, they just keep wandering around. And Hebrews tells us that it's because they were pilgrims, strangers and pilgrims, and they were still looking for a better country, even better than the physical land of Israel. They were looking for that spiritual land, that lower garden experience that they knew was just beyond sight, because there were times when they lifted their eyes and they were actually looking into that realm and they knew it was right there. But for most of our lives, those special sights into the supernatural, into the heavenlies, into the garden, typically it's concealed from us. And even when it does happen, like we were talking after class last night, you may not even know it until later, when you consider that your physical circumstances just didn't add up to the experience. And in some weird way, time stood still, or in my case, people that were standing right in front of me couldn't see me when I was at Haran. It was strange. I think, like with Mary in the garden looking for Yeshua, at first she didn't really understand where she was. She thought she was in a physical garden, but she's in a resurrection garden, talking to a resurrected Yeshua, talking to angels. And so she has walked into that other realm unwittingly. And so did Abraham and Sarah know what they were doing in Haran? I think they did. They may not have understood everything they were doing, but the biblical text does go so far as to say that they made the souls. And so that tells you that there was some sort of, I don't want to say conversion, but definitely influence. While they're waiting, while they're camping, while they're hanging out, waiting for the next leg of the journey, they're busy, which goes back to the theme of last night's lesson, Lekh Lekha. And it boiled down to three basic things. First, it means go. And then it means grow. And then it means bestow. And I'll pull that slide up for you here in a second so you can see how that works. And you can see that, especially in this Torah portion, that it's comprised of making that initial decision to go from where you are, to leave your family, everything you've held dear, everything you understand that's comfortable, that has contributed to who you are up to that point. You leave there and you go someplace you've never really been before. And that's why we call it faith. You don't exactly understand everything about the place where you're going, but you go anyway. And in this journey, you grow, because that's part of the blessing. He promised that you will grow along the way. And at some point, like we say, the critical difference between the blessing on Abraham and the people who went before him is he wasn't the sole beneficiary. He didn't just receive the blessing, that there was an addition to his blessing that says, people who bless you, I will bless, and the people who curse you, I will curse. So he actually becomes a partner with Adonai as a benefactor, not just receiving the blessing, but now he has a responsibility and a privilege of being able to pass the blessings on to someone else. So here in the early days, even they are making souls. And the comment that Rashi makes to that phrase, the souls that they made in Haran, he says, where they took them in under the wings of the divine presence. Abraham would convert the men, and Sarah would convert the women. And the scripture considers them as if they had made them. In other words, they were such a great spiritual influence on the lives of the people in Haran that they actually joined themselves to Abraham and Sarah. And there were so many of them that in this Torah portion, when Abram decides to go chase down the kings who have taken Lot and his family, that he's able to outfit 318 armed men. So how that would represent the rest of their families, that's a pretty big number of people that would have been traveling with Abraham. And so, yes, I mean, he gave birth to a mini nation even before he gave birth to Isaac. So that's just a little foreshadowing there for our lesson. So now what I'm going to try to do is screen share with you. And if you haven't had a chance to look at last night's lesson, these will be the same PowerPoints going through there, except for today. We'll pick up pretty much where we left off last night. So there's the pictures there of Abraham and Sarah's, the entrance to their graves. They're at Haran, which we'll talk about today, because that's one place where Abraham pitches his tent. It's right there in the plains of Haran near Mamre. And these are the principles from last night of go, grow, and bestow. It's basically 3 sections to the blessing. You have to go from where you are, and then you will grow. In other words, I'll increase your good reputation, and then you in turn are going to be a benefactor for others. You will be the kind of the litmus test for how I can bless other people. If they're blessing you, then I can bless them. If they're cursing you, then I can curse them. That's going to be the deal from now on. So that's a pretty big responsibility. We also talked about how Lekh Lekha means go for yourself. And there's a dual benefit there. Some things are good for us, but they're not that enjoyable. Some things are enjoyable, but they're not good for us. With Lekh Lekha, when you start this journey with Adonai, you get dual benefits. You begin to do the things that are good for you. And then before you know it, you start finding yourself experiencing joy and pleasure in that which is good for you, which I compared it last night to biting into a Brussels sprout and finding out it tasted like a Butterfinger Blizzard. That would be great, right? If you like Butterfinger Blizzards. Because to me, Brussels sprouts, just like if I ever tasted a skunk, that has got to be what it would taste like. It's just nasty. But the mitzvot aren't like that. They're both good for us and healthy for us and life for us. And as we do them and we learn about them, what we find out is they're also pleasurable. They also bring joy and comfort and peace into our lives. So when somebody sees us keeping a commandment and they think we're under law and it's horrible and it's eating Brussels sprouts when all you have to do is eat Butterfinger Blizzards, the great news you can pass on is that, hey, look, the mitzvot, they are both healthy for me and I like them. Now, there might still be a few you don't like, but you grow into them. It's a journey. You don't get it all the second you cross over the river. Everything's not wonderful. There's still tests involved in the process. And then we talked about taking the yod from Sarah's name, splitting it in 2, so that Abraham's name could literally be made greater or bigger. And so he went from Avram to Abraham, and she went from Sarai to Sarah. So you get a little bit of math there. We looked at the 3 ancient alibis for not going on a journey like Abraham was challenged to do. And the 3 main alibis is that it will diminish your reproductive process, it will diminish your financial resources, and it'll diminish your name or your reputation, because it takes time being in the same place to build your good reputation with people, to build up a house. So we talked about that, and I didn't get these in the picture last night, so I went ahead and added those in so that you could see them to kind of illustrate the idea of what a great risk it was to go on a journey, whether you're just traveling because you need to go from one place to the other, or you're traveling to transport goods. You're probably not going to see a lot of single travelers. They're going to try to join up with bigger caravans for safety and protection. And these caravans carry merchant goods. And whenever you pass into a new territory, there would be officials there along the main routes. And you wouldn't travel the main routes because of robbers. You don't want to get off by yourself. And they'll go through your stuff, and they're going to demand a customs tax from ancient times. And I wanted to show you a trade route there on the left, in the picture on the left. That's a trade route older than Abraham. It's called the Aqaba, or the Scorpion's Ascent. And it's terrifying just to look at. I didn't walk up it. I didn't ride up it. I'll probably try it maybe in December just to see what it feels like. But those little dots you see, those are oil barrels. That's the guardrail, the modern guardrail to keep you from going over the side. So no, there's really nothing to keep you from going over the side. And so that was an ancient trade route to get you over those mountains in the Arava. And what they recently uncovered is an ancient tax collection house, and that's on the right-hand side. This one was apparently built up by the Romans, but most likely they built it on something that had been there before and before and before and before. Because it was such an ancient trade route, there would have always been somebody there who's going to collect taxes on what you're carrying over that trade route. So that was the big risk for Abraham and Sarah, especially traveling with their extended family. It's going to diminish them financially. They're going to have to pay taxes. And nothing has really changed, because if you purchase your plane ticket to Israel, check the breakdown of the cost. And if you still remember how to do ratios, then check the ratio of the taxes against the actual cost of the ticket. It's a huge portion of the ticket that is simply fees and taxes. So Pharaoh's customs officials are still out there. The Roman customs officials are still out there collecting taxes when you want to go to Israel. When you want to go and grow and bestow on that journey, they're trying to make sure that if you do go, you won't grow as much as you think you will, and whatever's left over, then you can bestow on someone else. That's why they say nothing ever changes in death and taxes, and that seems to be true from ancient times. So the blessings that were promised to Abraham addressed all of that. Although it is believed that the reason Sarah came to Pharaoh's attention was because of the customs. Passing into Egypt, they would have been gone through, the traveling party would have been gone through to see what kind of goods they had, what kind of people they had with them. That his officials would have noticed Sarah and how beautiful she was, and that would have been how she was taken into the harem. Okay, and I think last night we got at least to the part where Abraham pitched his tent. There's several places where Abraham pitches his tent, and sometimes the turn of phrase in Hebrew gives hints that he's not just pitching a tent, that there's something a little more intimate going on. In this particular case, it doesn't appear to be anything exceptionally intimate, because along the way, as he's going into the land, in chapter 12, that says, after he goes from Shechem, he builds an altar there. That's important because it's in the plain of Moreh. And remember, that's going to be flanked by Mount Ebal and Gerizim. So it's a plain of teaching. Moreh, that's a teacher. And so as the tribes, the 12 tribes, are going through the commandments and then the curses, the blessings and the curses, that's going to be part of their teaching as they go into the land. So he builds an altar there. And if we have time, we can look at that particular altar and what it might represent in terms of the resurrection and what, not just the resurrection, but the lower garden for the souls that are residing there now. So from there it says, he relocated to the mountain east of Beit El, and there's Beit El on the right, and pitched his tent with Beit El on the west and Ai on the east. And there's one view of Ai on the left-hand side. That's actually from the top of the mountain, and you can read more about it, I think, in maybe Joshua, where it talks about the men creeping up the mountainside to make an ambush. But that gives you an idea of what the terrain was like if you wanted to pitch your tent there. And then he journeys on. And I want to look at the idea of a tent right here, because it says, from there, he relocated to the mountain east of Beit El and pitched his tent. All right, what is a tent and what does it mean? If you'll look at the graphic, this was actually taken at Haran, not at Ai or Beit El, but I want you to focus on the word. And remember, you start on the right-hand side because you're reading Hebrew. And there's a picture there of the building that's built over the cave of Machpelah, where they're buried. But the sign, as you go in there, says, Ohel, Abraham, the Sarah, the tent of Abraham and Sarah. Because the tent of Abraham and Sarah is more than just a literal tent. It's iconic of a lot of things. And what's interesting is they had different tents, but it's the same tent. You say, well, how can that be? Well, it just can. That's the way it works. Typically, they did have different tents. The husband would have his tent, and if there were multiple wives, then they would each have their own tent. But in this case, instead of talking about the tents of Avram and Sarai, it's made it into a singular. And I want to look at that picture there as a picture of marriage and what would actually go on in a tent. Because that's the reason I read the verse that I read first, where it talked about how Avram and Sarai would bring them under the wings of the Shekhinah. The idea that they would bring them into the tent and teach them. One meaning of a tent in Scripture, and you have to look at context, but one meaning, and when it says tents, it means houses of study or schools, places where you study the word, not just anything, but where you're specifically studying the word. And the first mention we have here in the Torah portion is that Avram and Sarai made souls, and according to the rabbis, under the wings of the Shekhinah. They took them into the tents and they taught them the word, the Torah as they understood it, the message of monotheism as they understood it, having coming out of Ur of the Kasdim, which was full of pagan gods and idols and so forth. Now they're moving to new places who also have multiple gods, and they're preaching this message of one God, the God of Abraham. And that's part of this journey. So you can see there the spelling, and I want you to notice the spelling because I want us to look at some anomalies in the spelling in the biblical text. So let's look at that verse there. Genesis 12:8. It says, then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Beit El and pitched his tent. I'm having trouble reading when I do this. With Beit El on the west and Ai on the east. And then he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Right, in this particular location, I'll back it up here where you can, maybe I can't. I did want you to see. See Beit El there on the right? See that flat place on the mountaintop? That is where Jeroboam built an alternate altar for the 10 northern tribes. There was one here, and then I'll show you the picture of the one that was also built up in Dan in the north. And Abraham actually passed through there. So he was in both of these locations where there would be alternate altars, not the altar of Isaac on Mount Moriah, which we know is the Temple Mount, but the Israelites would build alternate altars because there was a spiritual significance to these locations. So they tried to tap into that. They just had to break the commandment in order to do it. But if you look where that smooth or the level place is, obviously you can see that structures were built there back at the time of Jeroboam, but around this location would have been where Abraham built an altar, and it would have also been where Jacob saw the angels of God ascending and descending. And the rabbis say that this ladder, this staircase, would have gone all the way from this location here at Beit El, and it would have sloped all the way to the Temple Mount. But this was one of the, I hate to use it because it sounds so new agey, but a portal, a place for entry, a place to move between two realms that had some sort of spiritual significance. So Abraham builds an altar here. And I think that part of that altar building is going to be intercession. Abraham is a prophet, and perhaps he's given a glimpse into the future.
Uh-huh.
It's only a parish of
He's going to be given a glimpse into his children's future and see that there will be idolatry in the future, and perhaps even before it occurs, he can begin interceding. And if that sounds incredible, then how many of you prayed for your children before they were ever born? You knew they were coming, and you didn't just pray for your children. Maybe you prayed for their future husband or wife. Maybe you started praying for your grandchildren even before your children were born. And so Abraham's a good father too, and that may account for some of the reasons where he built altars where he built them. Is something significant will happen there later, and they will have needed that intercession on their behalf. Okay, let's go back to the scripture itself. And you can see the red arrow where it says he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Beit El and pitched his tent. All right, where the red arrow is pointing is the word for tent in that Hebrew verse. You can see it's different from what you saw back here. See the difference? Ohel. Wow, that sounds strange in English, doesn't it? And then over in the verse, it's ahalo. It goes from ohel to ahalo. Now, if you weren't looking at the spelling, it would still make sense because you're adding a possessive. When you say O, when you add the vav with the dot on top of it, that's an O sound. And that makes it a masculine, singular possessive. So if you weren't reading it, if you were just listening to me say it, ahalo, it sounds right. His tent. But then when you look at how the text is actually spelled, you're saying, what in the world? Because a he has been added to the tent. Mysteriously, just like a he was added to the name Sarai and Avram, when the yod was taken away, it was split into two hes, and one of them got a he, and the other one got a he. And so now his tent, yes, that's what it says when you say it out loud, but when you read it, it's more like her tent. Because ahala would be her tent. And it's kind of a strange pushing together of two different words, his tent and her tent. So whose tent was it? Yes. We're learning to say that, aren't we? Yes. So there's an anomaly. Now it occurs in another place. But here's the explanation. So if you go back and you look at the PowerPoints later, I think a lot of you go back and you just slow down and go through the PowerPoint. So that's why I'm trying to do those more, to give you something to look at and stop and freeze it if you need to kind of absorb, especially if we're looking at Hebrew. So you can see the standard spelling of ahalo, which sounds very Hawaiian to me, but ahalo, or is it mahalo? Okay, I'm confused. We've got ahalo, which is going to be third person, singular, masculine, possessive, which is a bunch of grammar words. But it's just as simple as what I explained to you. If you hear ahalo, it's his tent. But if you read without the vowels, which weren't there originally anyway, ahala, then it's her tent. So our spelling of ahalo, it's got the same letters as the feminine, but it has the vowelization of the masculine. And the rabbis conclude from this that a man should provide his wife for proper housing. For one should honor his wife more than himself. I think it goes even deeper. I think it's teaching us the unity of marriage, that even though they are two, they are one. And I think this came up last week. So I wanted to show you a couple of the verses that are used in the commentaries to speculate on what exactly happened with Noah while he was naked in his tent. You can see this anomaly also in Genesis 9:21, where it says he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. So we read that in English and we assume that Noah took his own clothes off. And apparently he did. That may have been part of what happened. But you have to realize who himself also could have been. So the red arrow there, you can see, again, that anomaly with the tent where it's kind of like the masculine and the feminine are smushed together. It's ahalo with the masculine pronunciation, but with the feminine spelling. So is it his tent or her tent? If we go to Leviticus 20:11, this could explain it, and this is how some scholars explain it. It says, if a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. So the way Scripture views it is, if you see your father's wife, then you've actually seen your father naked. Even though that's not your father, that's your mother or maybe a stepmother. But if you see his wife, then you have seen him. They're together. And so they say that may be the basis for understanding, the nakedness inside the tent. It may not have been just Noah. It may have been Noah and his wife, because his wife, if she is seen naked, then you have also seen Noah's nakedness. And then the interesting thing is he doesn't just curse Ham, he curses Canaan, which is where Abraham's going to, by the way. And Ham is called in the text his little son, Hakatan, the one who has been made small. And it seems that even at that point, before the giving of the Torah, Noah's sons knew, and grandsons, they already knew it was not permitted for them to either look upon Noah or his wife's nakedness. because if you looked upon one, you looked upon the other. And so as you're reading that text about Noah, it says that Noah woke up, and it says he immediately knew something had been done to him. Not just that somebody looked, but that something physical was actually done. Now, there's different ideas about what was done. I've heard they said that Ham emasculated his father, but I think it was Rabbi Foreman. Maybe not. It could have been Rabbi Tatz. No, I think it's Foreman. Somewhere back there actually did a teaching on the fact that it could have actually been Kenan, the grandson, who did something either to Noach or to Noach's wife to bring on that curse. And perhaps they were in it together, Ham and Kenan. But the text doesn't tell us, so we don't necessarily need to know. What we can get from it is that anomaly of the tent where the two could possibly be referred to as one. So what affects one is going to affect the other. Where else can we see that? Isaiah 51:1. It says, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness. If you're not pursuing righteousness, there's no need to listen. But which that's great. It just kind of cuts off part of the audience. But he says, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father. I'm assuming this is going to be the rock from which we are hewn. And to Sarah, who gave birth to you in pain. I'm assuming this is the quarry from which we were dug. And I put in light letters the part that has been included in English but is not in the Hebrew. It says, when he was but one, I called him. Then I blessed him and multiplied him. So we've gone from two things, a rock and a quarry, two people, Abraham and Sarah, and then all of a sudden they become one. And then they become him. See, remember, if you hear the ahalo of the tent, it sounds like a him, but it's spelled like a her. So it says, I called him, then I blessed him, and I multiplied him. So is the him one or two? It appears to be two, even though it's one. Because if you look for the red arrows pointing in the text, you can see why they felt the need to add the English words to clarify it for us. When he says, when one, I called him, then I blessed him and multiplied him. You can see the English translators are struggling with that, and they still haven't solved the problem. But they've added some words. I guess they think that's going to help. But it's sufficient, I think, in Hebrew when it says, then I blessed him, when one, I called him. So, ki echad, when one. That's literally what it says. So the question is, Abraham and Sarah, are they one or are they two? Yes. It goes back to Genesis 1:27. We can get more examples here. It says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So is it him or them? Yes. And Yeshua explains it. Matthew 19:4-8, which he's quoting. And it says, he answered, and he said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And then they challenge him. They say, well, why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of the hardness of your heart. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it was not this way. So the original plan was for the two to become one, to become two, to become one, to become two, to become one. That's kind of a never-ending cycle. Talk about a journey of marriage, right? Did I skip one? No, I didn't. So let's look at the blessings. Let's see if the blessings are one or if they're two. Genesis 12, it says, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. He just split the yod and gave each one a head. He says, I will bless her, and indeed, I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Okay, now compare that to Abraham's blessing. Genesis 17:4. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be a father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Avram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. So they're almost identical. So did he bless him, or did he bless her and him? Yes. That's what the text says. So in terms of unity, if we go to Exodus 21:10, which is the basis of Jewish law for marriage, there are three things a husband cannot reduce. If he's a healthy man, he cannot reduce these things for his wife. Her food, which is she'erah, her clothing, which is kasuta, and her conjugal rights, which is ona. And the beautiful thing about that passage is you can read it two ways. You can read it as merely physical requirements, or you can see that the words used are not the normal words for those things, and you can begin to read the spiritual obligation of the husband to his wife. Let's take the first there. If it's just talking about physical things, are there examples where it's not just as in here, where he may not reduce food, clothing, or conjugal rights? Let's see where the female is also taking on those obligations. If we look at Proverbs 31, 14 through 16, which, by the way, these are parables of the Holy Spirit. If you read Mishlei or Proverbs, these are parables of the Holy Spirit working against the forces of darkness. But she also supplies the food. It says she's like merchant ship. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it's still night and gives portions to her household. She considers a field, buys it from her earnings. She plants a vineyard. So what is she doing? She's providing food for her household. Same thing with the coverings. It says she's not afraid of the snow for her household are clothed with scarlet. She makes coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. So we still see that the female aspect of the unity is also taking an active role in the physical part of the obligation. What about conjugal rights? 1 Corinthians 7:3, Paul explains that it's not one way, that both are responsible. He says concerning conjugal rights that the women don't have the authority of their own body, but the man, and the man does not have the authority of his own body, but the woman. And it says, neither one of you should be abstaining from that responsibility unless it is by mutual agreement and for a specific purpose of fasting and prayer. Is it okay to withdraw for periods of fasting and prayer, focusing on your spiritual development? Sure. But it's not a unilateral decision. You have a talk. and you come to an agreement that this is what must be done. But we can go deeper. If we look at she'er, which is food, you can see that it's only translated as food once. It usually means your flesh, your body, or your near kinswoman, somebody whose flesh is like your own flesh. Remember Adam saying, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone? Well, when it says the husband has to provide her food, what is it actually saying? It's saying you need to be as near to your wife as you are to your own flesh. You need to reveal your flesh to her, to reveal yourself. That requires intimacy. Because there's other Hebrew words that would be more normal in this context, like lechem or machachal. Those words are more generic words for food. But if we go back and we look at this, intentionally a different word has been chosen to show that it's not just giving her something to eat, give her yourself. Remember Yeshua making everybody go crazy by saying, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood? What did he mean by that? Unless you become intimately close to me and take my words inside of you. And that's what a husband and wife should do. They should take the words inside of one another, like food. That's why it's such a grievous thing to call our spouse a name. Even in the heat of anger, you have to control the words that come out of your mouth that they might eat. They might take inside of them and make part of their own flesh. Because what you want to see in the other person is what you need to call. If you start calling your spouse a female dog, or if you start calling your spouse a jackass, then I think you can expect eventually to get exactly what you say. You can name the creation. Just don't be upset when that's what comes back, because that's the food you're feeding them. The next was clothing or coverings, which comes from kusuta. And it does mean a covering or something for concealment. But let's go back and look at the word origin, which is going to be the Hebrew out of Thayer's 3680 and the verb form. Kasa is its root, verb root, and it means to cover. See how many times it means to cover more than it means a covering, and why the word would be noticed as kind of being out of place here? If it's going to mean cover 135 times, but it's only going to be a covering twice, then what should the emphasis be? To cover over for protection. That's what it's talking about, to cover your wife, to protect her, not just put the physical clothes on her back, yes, but to cover her physically and spiritually. Because if we take that verb and we put it into the hitpael, it means to cover yourself or to clothe yourself. So when you cover your spouse, what are you doing? You're covering yourself. When you expose your spouse's weak points, i.e. sharing, prayer requests, gossip about your spouse, you're not just uncovering their nakedness, you're uncovering your own. You're basically opening that blouse up and saying, take a look. So it's our responsibility to cover one another. That, can you go to counseling? You bet. But just to get on the phone and gossip about your spouse? No. You may as well take a naked selfie and put it out on the internet. That's the equivalent. That's the nastiness of exposing your spouse's weak points to someone who's not truly there to help you pray through that thing or to counsel you through that thing. And there's a difference, and we all know what it is. So when a husband clothes his wife, he's covering her in both a spiritual and a physical way. He becomes a barrier for her against demonic elements and vice versa. We intercede for our husbands. And we can see that reflected if we look at Ephesians 5:28. It says, "For no man ever hated his own body, but he nourishes and cherishes it." So our spouse's body is our own body. And we take care of it with just as much care and detail as we do our own body. Now, just a heads up, you probably don't, if it's a guy, he's not going to use as many different kinds of shampoo and, skin softener and all that sort of stuff. But they nourish their bodies in different ways. So that's the good news. They won't be buying as many, personal hygiene products as we will. Let's see. So the man is actually, according to Rashi, and I don't know if I put this on the PowerPoint, but basically Rashi's comment in terms of what Abraham and Sarah teach us is that by pitching Sarah's tent first, he was fulfilling these obligations. That he was putting her needs before his own and putting her honor, her covering before his own, and therefore he was deriving great benefit from that relationship, that they were truly one tent even though they were two tents. Why does a husband need to cover his wife? And remember, the ona, the third thing, is a space of time, which typically that can be interpreted as conjugal relations, but it can also just mean time. So what is a husband obligated to give to his wife? His time. And not just time, but intimate time. And what might be intimate to her on a given day might be different from what he considers intimate on a given day. Both are okay. But you have to know the other person to know whether the person needs a hug or full intimacy. And we have to try to accommodate one another where the two are really one. That means sometimes we may sacrifice in order to meet the other's needs, and sometimes it means the other might sacrifice to meet our needs. Part of this lesson of the spiritual covering and making sure that at the very least we're covering those three bases. Food, revealing our inner flesh to one another. Covering one another spiritually with prayer, with not revealing our nakedness to other people, our weak points, and with the ona, the times of intimacy. That protects us against the fugitive. Who's the fugitive? Well, there was a fugitive in the garden who walked up and convinced Eve that it was okay to eat this fruit. Adam did not guard the garden. We're going to see that commandment given to Abraham and Sarah in this Torah portion, that they are going to guard the covenant. A covenant had been made with Adam and with Eve, but they didn't guard it against the fugitive. And this Torah portion, as we go into Rashi and some of the rabbinic sources, I think Bereshit Rabbah, if I'm not mistaken, they identify the fugitive who comes to Abraham and tells him that Lot has been taken. And Og, we know, was one of the last of the Rephaim that existed before the flood, the giants before the flood. Other types of giants are Anakim, Nephilim. There's other names for them in the land. There's some sort of hybrid type of being that were not physical enough to be destroyed by the flood. But the Rephaim do have an essence of weakening over time, because we see Og, by the time Moses returns with the Israelites, Og is the last of the Mohicans, so to speak. He's the last of the race of the Rephaim. They died out. But it's understood that Og, and it's because of the wording in the text as Moses conquers Og, that they say, you should already know who Og is, that he was the fugitive that came to Avram, and his plan is that Avram will be killed when he chases after the kings, and then Og can marry Sarai and corrupt, basically, as we're talking about, the line of all the way to Messiah at that point. We saw the danger of that with Pharaoh. Later, we'll see it with Abimelech. And so she's taken into Pharaoh's harem, who we know on the spiritual side, we can compare to the king of Abaddon. And again, Pharaoh can corrupt the line of Messiah. So there will be supplanters in the garden. So honoring and protecting your wife, honoring and protecting your husband in the garden, that's part of making sure that the fugitive, like Og, or a Pharaoh, or a serpent, or an Abimelech, or the one with the fatal wound in Revelation, who's trying to imitate the life of Messiah, that we're not fooled by those things, and we're not corrupted by those things. And the Torah portion commentary makes the comment that it's because of who Lot was hanging out with that he was nearly destroyed. So who you hang out with, you might be relatively righteous compared to them. But if you're hanging out with them, and basically it said Lot pitched his tent all the way to Sodom. There's a deep implication there. We don't know how much Lot compromised. He did know a righteous messenger when he saw one. He did recognize the angels. He did still have a spirit of hospitality about him. But apparently he compromised in a lot of ways by where he pitched his tent. Here's another use of the tent. And I wanted you to at least see it with proper grammar and spelling. And this is from Genesis 24:67. And again, we've got the translators supplying words that aren't there. And I think it's easier to understand the prophetic value of the verse when people quit trying to fill in words that aren't there. Sometimes it helps us understand, and sometimes I think it gets in the way. Because adding words helps us nail something down that the text did not intend to be nailed. It wanted you to have to float a little bit to reach for the spiritual meaning. And it says, then Isaac brought her, which is Rebekah, into his mother Sarah's tent. And remember what we know about Sarah's tent, that it's understood that Shekinah dwelled over that tent, and that's how they made souls. And it says, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's, see, the translator put in their death. But if you look at the text, it's not there. If you can read that Hebrew text right there. Now, I did put the red arrow over her tent. Ha-o-hela. Ha-o-hel-ah. Hear the difference in the pronunciation? You're getting the the feminine of the tent. This would be proper grammar and vowelization for the tent. Ha-o-hela instead of ahalo. But by adding the word death in there, which we can understand that, but I think if we leave it out the way the text, because it just says achare imo, after his mother, and that's where the text stops. It doesn't say death. It just says after his mother. So Isaac was comforted after his mother. And here's how the here's how Rashi, which he's referring back to Bereshit Rabbah, comments on this verse. It says, then she, Rebecca, when she went into the tent, and remember, a tent can also mean a tent of study. That's how they would make converts. They would sat in the tent and they would have studied together. They would have talked through this idea of monotheism, of there being one God who made everything. It says, then Rebecca became the image of Sarah, his mother. For all the time that Sarah was alive, lamp would be a light and a blessing would be found in the dough. That is, it would increase miraculously and a cloud would be stationed over the tent. But once she died, they stopped. And when Rebecca came, they returned. So in that Jews see a Messianic expectation. A lamp, bread, and the cloud of the Shekinah. Let's see if we can find that. If you look up these incidents where Yeshua multiplied bread, they're all over the Gospels. They don't just mention it one time. There's this many fish and this many loaves, or in this case, in this many people. In this case, it's this many fish, this many loaves, and this many people. And he's teaching something different each time. This one's just an example where it says Yeshua went out, he saw a great multitude. He was moved with compassion for them. He healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, this is a deserted place. The hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. It almost makes you wonder if it's almost Shabbat, because they're acting like if they don't get food now, they're not going to get food. But Yeshua said to them, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they said to him, we have only here, how many loaves? 5? I can't see it. Yeah. We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. And then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. That's important. Because remember, you received the song of Moses like dew on thirsty grass. So what are they doing? They're studying. They're listening to him teach the Torah. And it says, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples. And the disciples gave to the multitudes. That's the pattern. You go, you grow, then you bestow. Yeshua is trying to teach the disciples this lesson. He's like, no, you give them something to eat. I've blessed you, now you bless them. And the disciples, they're like, we are like, what? He says, okay, here's how you do it. I'm going to make a blessing on it, and miraculously, the dough is going to be increased. And so they gave to the multitudes. Remember, Abraham is going to be the father of a multitude of nations. So they all ate. Who? The multitudes. And went away filled, and it says, then they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Well, there's our 12 tribes. So we saw that Abraham was making converts among the nations in Haran even before the 12 tribes descended from him. In fact, it says that he was in covenant with the men who went with him to recover Lot. When he was camped there at Mamre, he's making converts the whole time. So there's a sign of Messiah. He multiplies the dough. That would be a sign of Sarah's tent. What about the cloud of the Shekinah over the tent and the lamp? Well, we can see that in Matthew 17. It says, while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. I think that's especially important in light of Yeshua being typified by Isaac in the resurrection. What about the lamp? Well, it says, then Yeshua spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So we've got the 3 signs of Messiah in Yeshua. We've got the dough that supernaturally increases. We've got the cloud of the Shekinah, and we've got the Lamb. All right, here's a couple pictures, which I thought the one on the right was funny, not instructive. This is down at the Dead Sea. And as you go down to the Dead Sea, there's lots of hotels. And I looked up at one of the hotels, and it was the Lot Hotel. And I'm like, who's going to stay at the Lot Hotel? Well, apparently somebody is. So I can see some towels drying out there outside the windows. But there's the Dead Sea, which apparently was like a garden, a well-watered garden before the destruction. And I don't know how many people stayed at the Lot Hotel, but he did have a wonderful sense of hospitality. That says that Lot lifted his eyes. So just imagine what he saw. He's not seeing just natural streams and rivers and fields and things growing, trees. He's seeing things in a different realm. It says, Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of the Yarden, that it was well watered everywhere. It says, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It says, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. And that's from Genesis 14:10. So Lot is seeing more than just a place to graze his sheep. He sees into a prophetic realm of the Yarden, of the coming down of the waters of Eden. And when it mentions the land of Egypt, that reminds us of the Pishon River in Genesis 2. Remember that outer river was the Pishon? And they say the physical counterpart is the Nile. And so Lot can see pretty much the Pishon. He can see the rivers of Eden and see how wonderful they are. And what does he do? Instead of elevating himself to that realm, he takes the low road. He descends back to that physical road and descends into a place of sin. And Avram, on the other hand, goes high. He lifts his eyes and he goes to Hebron. And supposedly this is where there is an entrance to the garden where Adam and Eve are buried, now where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. And this is the building that is built over the cave of Machpelah. And this is where Avram chooses to go. Why would he choose that spot? Maybe because if anything is going to preach to his descendants, he believes in the resurrection, it's going to be this place, the entrance back to the garden. And again, where does he build an altar? Hebron. Genesis 14:14, the Lord said to Avram after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now. What he does when he lifts his eyes is going to be different from what Lot does. It says, look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. Who are the descendants of Abraham? Those who do the works of Abraham, is what Yeshua said. He says, I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Avram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. So I'm going to back it up again so you can kind of get an idea of the location. Of course, that big building would not have been there, nor the pavement. But that's kind of an idea of what the area would look like. And he builds an altar. And we can see from the altars he builds, each one is somehow teaching us a lesson of the lower garden or of resurrection. He builds one near Bethel, which is a place that we would know where Jacob's ladder was. Also a place of great sin for the northern tribes because there was an alternate altar there. Mount Moriah, of course, is going to represent the resurrection of Isaac and therefore the resurrection of Yeshua. He builds an altar at Hebron, which is the entrance back to the garden. He builds an altar on the plain of Moreh near Shechem, where we'll find Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, the teaching mountains, that are going to stipulate the residency requirements of the covenant. Remember, like the two trees? He says, Adam and Eve, I'm putting you in this garden, but here are the residency requirements. If you want to live in here, there is a wall, by the way. And if you can't live in this garden according to these stipulations, then you'll have to leave. You'll have to go live somewhere else. But you can't live in this lower garden according to your own rules. You have to live according to my rules if you're going to be a citizen here. And so in the plain of Moreh, the Israelites have to keep repeating the terms of the covenant, the blessing and the cursing. So if I want to live in here, then I have to learn the Torah. Because if I come into this place and I don't keep the Torah, then I don't really have any faith that he's going to address that and kick me out. And there's more altars in the land, but I thought those are, at least from the Torah portion, a pretty good summary of how each one is going to represent some aspect of the lower garden or the resurrection. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I can see there's something coming up on chat. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. The time, too. Okay, I'll just keep going, and if you guys have to jump off and go to work or go do whatever you need to do, I'll just, for the sake of last night's class, we'll go ahead and run on to the end, and then you could watch it later if you want. I'm going to go back to screen share. It moves you guys every time I do that. Okay, and here's our responsibility. If we're talking about, if we're going to make a covenant, and we see over and over the covenant here is mentioned, and we even, in this Torah portion, it takes us through the covenant between the pieces, where the two pieces are really one piece. It's one animal, but two pieces. The relationship with Abraham and Sarah, they are one, but they are two. What passes between them is the flaming torch that I believe is Yeshua. But it says in Genesis 17:9, it says, and God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. So whether we're talking about Abraham's physical descendants or those prophetic nations, the souls that he and Sarah made, even before he had physical children, if we are their descendants, then there's a requirement. It's to keep the covenant. If we want to be restored to that lower garden and take semi-permanent residence in the lower garden. I think the whole idea of the lower garden is to prepare you for the upper garden so that you can ascend to the throne and be part of that experience with the body of Messiah. But even if you want to stay in the lower garden, you have to accept the covenant. And not accepting it with your mind is one thing, but guarding it is another. That means doing it. So if Abraham and Sarah were making souls, it means they were doing souls. They really believed in the covenant. And so it says there, if you look at the red arrow, there's an imperative form of guarding or keeping, tishmor. Shmor means to guard. So he's saying, if you want to be one of Abraham's descendants, the message to us would be, same as it was for Abraham, if you really want to go in this entrance back to the garden, Abraham, you've purchased this property for a burial ground for you and your descendants. Patriarchs and matriarchs are there in pairs. If you want to come back into this garden, there is a requirement. When you come into that garden, you have to agree that yes, there is a citizenry requirement, and that's to guard the covenant. Tishmor. That goes back to Genesis 2:15. It says, then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend it and keep it. You can see the other red arrow there. Ul Shamra, which is going to be a compound word with conjunction and preposition and suffix. At any rate, you can see the root word, shamar, to guard. So in the beginning, if you wanted to be in the garden, you have to shamar. You have to guard. It's the same thing to the descendants of Abraham. You want to go back to that garden, then you need to start learning how to shamar, the covenant. That's the responsibility. And these are just kind of little extra things I put here at the end from the text where it talks about how Abraham chased the kings all the way up into the territory of Dan. And these are called the gates of Abraham because they've excavated a city that he would have passed through on this journey. And these would have been the original gates that Abraham would have passed through when he went to Dan. And then here, there's a little bit of information about it. It's they believe around 1700 BCE. And then if you wanted to see a reconstruction of kind of what it would have looked like. And then they actually have the quote from our Torah portion down there, where it talks about Lot was taken captive and he was led forth. That's inscribed in a little replica there. But you can see from there how it would have looked. They do actually have it covered, so it'll not erode any more than it already has. But it's just interesting to see where Abraham would have walked and what he would have seen on that journey. And the last thing here, because that part of his journey, going back to retrieve Lot, was part of one of the altar judgments that occurred in the land. And we know that the 4 altar judgments, they're in the Torah, they're in the prophets, and they're also definitely in the book of Revelation. They're famine and plague, sword, and wild beasts. And in fact, if you look at your 10 plagues, they will probably originate from one of those 4. If you go back and you find the really basic primitive meaning of all 4 of those, either linguistically or within its use. The 10 plagues of Egypt will all go back to the 4. So you've got famine. Famine sets in. Abraham and Sarah have to go down to Egypt. But when they get down to Egypt, like we were saying last night, in the text, it implies that the plague that came on Pharaoh's house here it is, that Sarai was actually summoning those plagues on Pharaoh's household. Where it says in chapter 12, verse 17, that says, Hashem afflicted Pharaoh along with his household with severe plagues because of the matter of Sarai, the wife of Avram. The comment to that is, the actual text is, Al Devar Sarai, where it's being translated out as about the matter of Sarai. You can also translate it as on the word of Sarai. In other words, they were saying Sarai found herself in a fix there, and she was actually speaking words. Remember where it says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you? Apparently, Sarai starts calling down a curse on Pharaoh's house so that he will know something is wrong here. And so we've got the famine, we've got the plague on Pharaoh's house, we've got the sword with the four kings, and then the fourth one is wild beasts. We say, what are wild beasts? Is it just lions and tigers run up in your house and try to kill you, or what is it? Well, it can be. It can be things that come from the realm of nature. Creatures that come from the realm of nature, but it also has a human application. And Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15:32, kind of gives us a hint. He says, if from human motives I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what does it profit me? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So that statement right there sums up what's happening in Sodom with the wild beasts. And that should sound really, really, really familiar, especially since the last election. I've never seen anything like this in the United States. But there's a long passage in Acts that describes the dynamics of wild beasts, because Paul is saying they were people behaving like beasts. If you scare one buffalo, how many buffaloes start running? The whole herd. If one lemming runs over and drowns itself in the ocean, how many lemmings will run over the cliff and drown themselves in the ocean? It's a mob mentality. It's pure instinct. There's no rationality of the spirit that's involved there. There's no logic. There's no reason. It's only reaction. And so the mindset there is, hey, we got things going pretty good for us right now. The Sodomites were primarily known for having, I forget where it is in the prophets, but they said they had great ease. They were very prosperous. They were doing very well for themselves, so much so that they had plenty of time to get themselves in trouble. See, the harder we work, the less trouble we're likely to get into. That's why, when your kids started hanging around the house, stirring up trouble, you figured out a project or a job for them to do, to get their minds on something constructive rather than destructive. So they had plenty of time to become very inhospitable, because those people would threaten their income. In fact, in one of the workbooks, maybe it's in this Torah portion that I put it in, there's references to, there was actually a law enacted in Sodom that said, if you welcomed the visitor, if you gave food to the hungry, then you would be put to death. That's how selfish and self-centered they were. For them, it was all about the eating and drinking and being merry, because tomorrow we die. So they were a commercial power. They were basically godless, because if you look at the names of the kings, Amraphel, they say that was Nimrod. And they break down the name Amraphel and what it means. Berah, it means evil to heaven. Birsha, it means to be in wickedness or to move yourself upward in wickedness. Shina, it means he hates his father who is in heaven. So these weren't good guys, these kings of this area. And so there is a godlessness in the sense that they become their own gods, no matter who they worship. They're not going to worship the God of Abraham. It's a hedonistic society, it's a violent society, and it's mob mentality. Now that should start to make sense. Do you think that it's possible, I don't want to speak for any other country, but at least in the United States, that we are experiencing the effects of a plague of wild beasts? Because let's look at the characteristics in Acts, which this is Acts 19:23 through 41. And you know the story. Paul has been preaching Yeshua, and all of a sudden the artisans are losing business because they make little silver idols of Artemis or Diana. And the story says, about that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. And I'm hoping you're thinking in your minds how the men of Sodom would have viewed both Lot and the angels. How would it have affected their business? He said, you see and hear that only in Ephesus, but not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people. See that Abraham had a reputation for making souls, saying that that which is made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger to this trade of ours to fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and something that I can't read will even be dethroned from her magnificence. When they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Now look at this, verse 29. The city was filled with great confusion, and they rushed with one, I'm trying to read it. They rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions. Verse 32, so then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. I have seen this time after time after time within the past several years. They will go into a mob of protesters or demonstrators and start interviewing, and they don't even know why they're there. Free pot, I don't know. They're just there. They're in confusion, and the majority do not know the reason they've come together. A few people do know why they're there. It's because they have been manipulated to do that. And we saw the plot. Who was plotting this? It goes on, it says they shouted for about 2 hours. We've seen it go on longer than that. And down in verse 38, it says, so then if Demetrius, they're trying to reason with him. So then if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled with the lawful assembly. For indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there's no real cause for it. And in this connection, we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. Those are the wild beasts at Ephesus. It's not just gnats and locusts and tigers and lions. It's people who act like wild beasts. They don't even know why they're there. They're in great confusion. And it's very easy for them to begin a riot, completely disregarding that there is a legal process for grievances and complaints. So I think we've just identified a sign of the times. And it goes all the way back to the time of Lot. You see how the men of Sodom approached Lot's house? Number one, they didn't want guests. They wanted to only profit in some way from the guests. They wanted to take advantage of the guests. And if they couldn't take advantage of the guests, they wanted to destroy the guests. Don't move in on our commerce. Don't move in on our hedonism and our godlessness. Mainly, and I think those are two parallels. Sodom, the mob mentality of Sodom, and the clue there was, they couldn't find the door, and there's not that many ways to miss the door. So it's a deep spiritual blindness. It's a mob mentality. It does not apply logic and reason. And it says that the rules I make are God. And that's why I guess I've said it the past couple of weeks. Our nation has gradually replaced biblical precepts and boundaries with social, man-made, the works of our own hands, the product of our own ideas of what is right and what is wrong. We have replaced that which has been written from ancient times into that which will change by the day, by the hour. The people that were for it a week ago will be against it this week. If someone they don't like is now for it, okay, if he's for it, then I'm against it. I'm against whatever he's for. And whatever he's for, I'm against. And it has nothing to do with logic and reason. It has to do with confusion, manipulation, hedonism. Don't tell me I'm not entitled to follow the dictates of my own wicked heart. And they do have the characteristics of Amraphel, who was said to have told Abraham, fall into the fiery furnace. Basically, go to hell. Berah does evil to the people. He's in evil. Birsha. He makes wickedness worse. Rasha is the word there for wickedness. Sinab, he who hates his Father in heaven. Why would anybody hate the Father in heaven? Because the Father says there's rules. There's a covenant. If you don't guard this covenant, then you go into the fiery furnace. Not Abraham, not Abraham's descendants, not the children of Abraham who will guard and keep my garden full of life and obedience and beauty. The Shekhinah, draw down the Shekhinah, keep the lamp of Shabbat going 24/7, multiply the bread. These are my people. And so sometimes, as distressing as it is to see the worst actors, they don't represent everybody. They only represent the confusion of those who have rejected the word. And the Father has to make a separation. And you can see multiple separations in this Torah portion where Lot lifts his eyes and sees the same thing Abraham sees and takes the low road anyway. And that's part of the journey, is people are going to drop. They're going to look and they're going to see the same thing we see, and they're going to settle for that which will pass away, which will be burned up, rather than to invest in preparing ourselves for resurrection with Yeshua and the citizenry requirements of that garden, to be in his presence so that he can present us perfect and complete and entire before the Father. I mean, don't you want Yeshua to be proud of you? You know, Father, you put them in my hand, and now I'm giving them back to you. And I hope I'm not presenting them back any worse than when I found them. And that's what we all need to do. If we're part of that go, grow, and bestow process, when he puts somebody under our influence, when he puts them in our hand to help inform that soul in righteousness, when they go back to the Father, we want to be able to say as a spiritual parent, I hope they're coming back to you in better condition than I found them.